He had spent 10 years hiding from the world, but nothing prepared Ethan Cole for the sight he found that night. A man bound to a pine tree in the frozen Montana woods, left to die with a warning on his lips. They're coming. Before Ethan could react, shadows moved through the snow. Not men. German shepherds. And the largest of them, wounded breath steaming in the cold, did something no human had done in years. It looked straight into Ethan's eyes and begged him to follow. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. The storm pressed heavily on the Montana mountains that night, swallowing the pines and carving white scars across the dark sky. Ethan Cole pushed open the cabin door, letting the wind slap against his coat, as if reminding him he was still alive. His tall, lean frame, 6 feet tall, hardened by years of solitude, yet thinned by isolation, moved quietly through the drifts. The deep brown leather jacket he always wore creaked in the cold, its age showing in each fold, like the years etched across his face. The red and navy flannel beneath it clung to him for warmth, though the cold had a way of settling into his bones more each winter. Ethan's gray eyes, sunken but sharp, scanned the woods with an instinct he could never unlearn. 10 years prior, he had been a respected search and rescue ranger, known for a calm steadiness that had saved dozens. But that steadiness broke the night he lost his wife and son to a river accident he failed to prevent. Since then, guilt had carved him hollow as the winds shaped these mountains. His dark brown hair now longer than it used to be, and brushing his collar carried streaks of silver near the temples, like frost that refused to melt. And beneath his jaw, an unshaven layer of rough stubble matched the ruggedness of a man who no longer cared about mirrors. With a flashlight in one hand and a small survival axe in the other, he moved through the trees with a slow, practiced rhythm. Snowflakes clung to his gray wool scarf, the only piece of clothing that felt like comfort his wife had knitted it the winter before she died. Tonight the snowfall felt different, heavier, whispering through the woods, as though carrying warning. Ethan muttered to himself, "Feels wrong out here." But his voice was swallowed immediately by the wind. The deeper he walked, the quieter the world became. That was when he heard it, a thin, broken sound, more breath than cry somewhere ahead. He froze. For a moment he wondered if loneliness had finally begun to play tricks on him. But then it came again, weak and trembling. Ethan swept his flashlight toward a cluster of old pines, the beam shaking only slightly. Habit, not fear. The light caught on something pale near the base of a tree. Ethan's breath hitched. A man was tied to the trunk, no lashed to it, his body sagging as if barely held upright by the ropes biting into his wrists. His clothes were torn, his face swollen and bruised, purple snow crusted along his eyebrows. The man looked about mid-40s with sandy blonde hair matted to his scalp, and a frame that suggested he had once been strong, but was now reduced to a trembling shell. The wind rattled the branches above them like bones. Ethan dropped to his knees, immediately cutting the rope with the small axe he carried. Hey, talk to me. Can you hear me?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. The man's eyes flickered open, muddy green and full of terror, the kind that didn't come from the cold. His cracked lips moved but produced only a rasp. Ethan leaned closer. What happened? The stranger swallowed hard breath, fogging faintly. He forced out 2 words, barely more than air. They... coming... Ethan stiffened. A cold ran deeper than any winter wind down his spine. Before he could ask more, the man went limp, collapsing into the snow like a puppet with its strings cut. Ethan checked for breathing, faint but present. He looked over his shoulder to gauge how far he was from the cabin, calculating whether he could drag the man back in time. That was when the sound reached him, footsteps. Not human. Soft. Fast. Purposeful. Ethan lifted his axe and rose slowly to his feet, turning toward the darkness between the trees. Every instinct he had ever trained flared to life. The wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable rhythm of multiple paws breaking through snow. Dogs. Big ones. He held his ground, though his breath quickened, misting in sharp bursts. At the edge of the flashlight beam, 3 figures emerged from the swirling snow, large German shepherds, their fur bristling, their silhouettes dark against the white night. The one in front was the largest, with a striking mix of black and deep brown fur and shoulders that rose nearly to Ethan's waist. Its ears were up, its posture alert, and its amber eyes gleamed with something dangerously intelligent. Ethan swallowed, tightening his grip on the axe. Easy. He whispered, not sure whether he was talking to them or himself. As the dog stepped farther into the light, the lead shepherd slowed, lowered its head, and sniffed the air. Its gaze locked on the broken ropes lying at Ethan's feet. It froze. A low, rumbling growl rolled from its chest, not aimed at Ethan, but at the sight, the scent, the cruelty embedded in the fibers. Then, unexpectedly, those fierce amber eyes lifted to meet Ethan's. Not hostile, not threatening, something else. A plea. Ethan blinked, thrown off balance by the raw emotion in the animal's stare. The shepherd took 2 steps forward, then gently grasped the leg of Ethan's jeans, with its mouth not biting, just tugging, before stepping backward into the snow, looking at him expectantly. Ethan whispered, almost incredulous, "Are you asking me to follow?" The dog released his jeans, let out a short, urgent bark, and turned toward the deeper forest. Ethan looked down at the unconscious man, then at the shepherd, the living shadow waiting at the edge of the light. His heartbeat trembled between fear and a strange, rising certainty. Something was terribly wrong in these woods. And this dog, this powerful wounded creature, was trying to show him what? Ethan exhaled a shaky breath and stepped after the shepherd. The snow around them darkened the flashlight, flickering as if warning him to turn back. But Ethan kept walking. He had no idea that this step would pull him into the most dangerous truth hidden in Pine Valley's endless winter. The chapter ends as the world falls into darkness, the only sound a distant bark fading through the storm. The storm eased only slightly by the time Ethan Cole dragged the unconscious man back toward his cabin, the snow crunching beneath his boots in a steady rhythm that did nothing to calm the unease tightening in his chest. Ethan's breath came out in harsh clouds as he supported the stranger's weight with his shoulder. Feeling the man's body shiver uncontrollably, despite the padded jacket that was torn almost to rags. The cold seeped through everything, but Ethan barely noticed anymore. Years of Montana winters had numbed his nerves long before tonight. His focus stayed on the stranger, thin, trembling, and bleeding, and on the dark canine shape following silently behind them through the trees. That dog. The lead German shepherd, the huge black and brown male with sharp amber eyes and a muscular frame built for speed and power, moved as quietly as snowfall. Ethan kept glancing back, half expecting the animal to vanish like an illusion conjured by stress and wind. But no, the dog was real paws, sinking deep into the snowhead, low in constant alertness gaze, always scanning the darkness. Ethan had seen trained canine dogs before during his years as a search and rescue ranger, but this one felt different. Younger than Ethan expected, maybe 5 years old, with a coat that gleamed under the faint moonlight, and scars near the shoulder that spoke of violence. The shepherd walked as if calculating every sound, every scent, every threat. It was a survivor. And something about that stirred a quiet, buried instinct in Ethan, the old part of him that used to protect others, the part he'd tried so hard to silence. When they reached the cabin, a small wooden structure patched with years of repairs, Ethan pushed the door open with his boot and carried the stranger inside, laying him gently on the old cot near the fireplace. The cabin smelled faintly of pine smoke and loneliness. The shepherd stopped at the threshold, standing perfectly still, like a guard posted at a king's chamber. Ethan glanced at him again. The dog didn't growl, didn't cross the doorway, only watched his breath puffing in soft clouds. "You're a strange one," Ethan muttered, but his voice carried a reluctant warmth he hadn't used in years. He didn't know why. Maybe because the dog's eyes held something he recognized, an understanding of pain, of loss, of fighting to survive. Ethan shut the door partially, leaving it cracked open. He didn't want to trap the animal, nor did he want to seem threatening. Then he knelt beside the wounded man. "Hey," Ethan said softly, tapping the man's cheek. "Stay with me." The stranger's eyelids fluttered. Up close, Ethan noticed more detail, stubble covering a jaw that once looked firm, a cut along the brow still bleeding, and hands rough like someone used to physical labor. His breathing remained shallow, each inhale a desperate fight. Ethan grabbed a first aid kit from the shelf, a metal box dented on one side, and began cleaning the man's wounds with practiced hands. Despite the years, muscle memory guided him: apply pressure, stabilize the head, keep the airway clear. His pulse quickened, not because of fear, but because something old inside him flickered back to life. Something he had tried to bury under 10 years of grief. Responsibility. Purpose. But as soon as he felt it, a familiar ache clawed up his throat. He could still see the river that took his family. Still hear his wife's scream. Still feel the cold weight of his child's lifeless hand in his own. He swallowed hard and pushed the memories back down. Not now. The stranger groaned, eyes opening halfway. Ethan leaned forward. "What happened to you? Who did this?" For a moment the man seemed unable to form words. His cracked lips parted his voice, a mere whisper shredded by fear. "They wanted the dog." Ethan froze. His eyes flicked toward the open door where the shepherd waited like a silent shadow. "What dog?" The man swallowed painfully. "They wanted Shadow." He coughed a painful rattling sound, then forced out, "Don't let them find him." His head slumped back. Ethan stared at him, stunned not just by the warning but by the name. "Shadow," he repeated under his breath, glancing again toward the door. The shepherd lifted his head at the sound, ears pricking, as if acknowledging the name he had been given long before Ethan spoke it. It fit. A creature that moved in silence, appearing and disappearing between trees like a living shape of night. But why would anyone want a dog badly enough to torture a man? Ethan felt his stomach tighten, an instinctive dread curling inside him. Whatever the stranger had witnessed, it was serious. Deadly serious. Before he could ask more, a sharp crack echoed across the forest, a gunshot carried on the wind. Shadow sprang to his feet instantly, teeth-bared muscles tensing beneath his thick coat. He released a deep, furious bark that vibrated through the cabin walls, a sound that came from fear and rage intertwined. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Gunshots out here meant one thing: someone was hunting. And judging from Shadow's reaction, the target wasn't Ethan, it was the dog. Ethan grabbed his coat and slung it on. "Okay," he muttered, his voice trembling with adrenaline and something heavier. "Okay, I get it." For the first time in 10 years, he didn't hesitate. He couldn't abandon a wounded man, and he couldn't ignore the fear radiating from a dog who had shown nothing but intelligence and strange loyalty. He moved to the door. Shadow backed away slightly to give him space, then looked up at him with eyes that burned like amber under moonlight. Ethan could almost hear the plea in them, the same silent request he'd felt in the forest. The storm howled outside. The gunshot echoed again, closer this time. Ethan tightened his grip on the axe, exhaled slowly, and stepped outside. For years he had hidden from the world. Tonight the world had come to his door, and it demanded he step forward. Shadow trotted ahead, steady and purposeful. Ethan followed, and the hunt began. The morning crept into the Montana forest as a pale gray smear across the sky, muted and cold, still thick with the icy breath of the storm that had shaken the valley through the night. Ethan Cole walked through the deep snow with Shadow at his side, the dog's steady gait matching his own. Ethan's boots crunched with each step, while Shadow moved almost silently except for the soft rhythm of his breath. The air bit sharply at Ethan's exposed skin, but after all these years of surviving the wilderness, the cold barely registered. What pressed on him harder was something heavier, the beginning of a truth forming in the back of his mind, a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to see clearly. He paused at a cluster of tracks in the snow, kneeling to brush away a thin crust of ice. The footprints were large, heavy boot marks, 3 sets, each pattern identical, each step deep with military precision. Someone trained. Someone hunting. Shadow sniffed the prints, too, his ears flattening slightly, as if he remembered the scent all too well. Ethan watched the dog closely. "You know who these belong to, don't you?" he murmured. Shadow's eyes, amber and piercing, flicked toward the deeper woods, then back at Ethan. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine, just stared with a kind of grim understanding that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Behind them, the cabin was a small dot between the pines, with the wounded man still unconscious inside. Ethan had checked on him at dawn. The stranger's breathing was unstable, but he was alive. Every so often he mumbled in feverish panic, as if reliving a nightmare. One phrase repeated again and again. "Don't let them find him. Don't let them find Shadow." Ethan rose to his full height, brushing snow from his worn leather jacket. As he did, Shadow began leading the way, not with aggression, but with a somber urgency. Ethan followed. For a long while they trudged wordlessly through the woods until they reached an abandoned clearing, where the snow was thinly stained by soot and ash. Ethan knelt again, fingertips brushing the frozen ground. There were scorch marks shaped like the remains of campfires, but arranged strangely too many too close circles, overlapped, as if something had been burned here regularly. Something large, something metallic. Ethan's breath hitched as he spotted another clue, a strip of fabric snagged on a dead branch. He pulled it free with a gloved hand. It was a piece of a tactical vest. Black nylon. Government grade. But not standard issue. Modified, reinforced. Ethan had worn enough gear in his past life to know this wasn't legal. Shadow stiffened beside him, muscles coiled under his thick fur. His lip curled slightly, not in a threat, but in what could only be described as memory fear mixed with anger. And it was then, as Ethan studied the dog more carefully, he noticed the faint raised scars under Shadow's fur near the shoulder. Thin lines. Perfectly straight. Surgical. He whispered, "What did they do to you?" Shadow lowered his head and stepped closer, nudging Ethan gently as if asking him to keep going. Ethan's mind spun. A highly trained shepherd's scars that looked like testing marks, military boots, illegal tactical gear, a man tortured simply for helping the dog escape. It was all forming a picture that chilled him deeper than the winter wind. They walked farther, guided by Shadow's strong instincts, until they reached a second clearing. This one was worse. Much worse. Half buried under snow lay the rusted remains of metal cages large enough to hold a grown dog, built from steel bars and reinforced bolts. Ethan brushed off one cage, fully revealing a serial number etched into the metal. The format was military, but a military branch that operated off-record in the shadows. Next to the cages lay a length of chain snapped, as if broken from desperate force. Ethan's pulse quickened. Jesus, he breathed. They were keeping you here, testing you here. Shadow paced slowly around the cages. Tail lowered his posture, echoing trauma. Ethan could feel the memories burning behind the dog's eyes, the confinement, the experiments, the cruelty. Suddenly, the wounded man's words returned to him like a punch to the chest. They wanted the dog. They wanted Shadow. Ethan exhaled shakily. You escaped, he said softly. And he, whoever he is, helped you get out. That's why they tied him to that tree, to silence him. Shadow looked at Ethan with a stillness that felt almost human in its gravity. For a moment, Ethan saw himself reflected in those amber eyes, two beings broken by different tragedies, both betrayed by forces they once trusted. Ethan felt something stir inside him, something long frozen. A bond, a quiet understanding born from suffering neither of them could speak aloud. He rested a hand on Shadow's head. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, Shadow leaned into the touch, a rare gesture, a fragile beginning. But before Ethan could absorb the significance of it, the sound of distant engines hummed through the forest, not loud but unmistakable. Snowmobiles, 3, maybe 4, moving in a coordinated sweep pattern. Ethan stiffened. Shadow did too, hackles rising. Whoever had tortured the stranger, whoever had run those illegal experiments, wasn't far. And they were coming back. Ethan clenched his jaw, feeling 10 years of self-imposed exile crumble beneath the weight of what he now knew. He had tried to hide from the world, but the world had dragged him back, dragged him into a fight he hadn't asked for, but could no longer walk away from. He looked at Shadow. The dog met his gaze with complete, unquestioning trust, and Ethan felt something he hadn't felt since the day he lost his family purpose. All right, he whispered. Whatever hell you've been through, we face what comes next together. Shadow let out one soft, resolute bark. The sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting a cold, pale light across the clearing, revealing the cages, the snow, the scars, both the dog's and Ethan's. A new partnership formed silently between them, forged not by choice, but by survival. And in that moment, Ethan realized the truth. He wasn't just protecting Shadow. Shadow was pulling him back to life. Together they turned toward the cabin, toward the danger, ready to face it. The blizzard struck Pine Valley with a fury that erased sky and earth into a single swirling void where snowflakes crashed like shards of glass against the trees, the wind howling as if the mountains themselves were warning what was coming. Ethan Cole pushed through the white chaos with Shadow at his side, the dog's powerful frame steady, despite the storm ripping across the forest. Ethan's worn brown leather jacket whipped violently around him, his scarf slapping against his jaw as he moved, but the cold barely pierced his thoughts. What chilled him far more was the truth that had solidified since dawn. They were not alone in these woods, and the men hunting Shadow were getting closer. The engines he had heard earlier were no hallucination. Now they roared through the storm like mechanical beasts, snowmobiles, slicing across the frozen terrain in a tightening circle. Ethan kept his breathing, even his instincts sharpening, in a way he hadn't allowed in a decade. 10 years ago, he had moved through dangerous terrain, as if reading a second language written in the wind. Now, as he sprinted through the pines again, that old fluency returned like a second heartbeat. He scanned the terrain, cataloging angles, shelter points the way, snow piled against fallen logs, 1,000 tiny details that determined life or death. Shadow stayed close ears, flattened against the wind, his black and brown fur dusted with snow, his eyes blazing with focus. Behind them, 2 more German shepherds emerged, the smaller one, with gray-tipped fur and a cautious temperament, and the larger tan and black one with a scar down his snout, a scar that made him look more intimidating than he actually was. They were Stray's Shadow's pack, but tonight they moved like trained operatives, each dog taking a position that covered the others. Ethan felt a strange awe at their coordination. "You three have done this before," he muttered, barely audible under the storm. Shadow glanced back, an expression almost like agreement. A moment later, the first snowmobile burst into view. The machine was driven by a man with a bulky frame and an all-black tactical snowsuit, the kind that blended into the darkness of pine trunks. He wore a black helmet with a tinted visor, reflecting only the pale storm light. Ethan recognized the suit's armor plates and reinforced seams. These were not ordinary criminals. This was organized, trained, ruthless. The rider slowed, scanning the area with a rifle strapped to his chest. Ethan instinctively ducked behind a fallen spruce, breathing shallow. Shadow and the other shepherds tucked down beside him, entirely silent, as if carved from the earth itself. The man's posture was rigid, calculated. Even through the blizzard, Ethan could sense his confidence, the confidence of someone who believed he controlled the hunt. That assumption would cost him. Ethan moved swiftly, drawing a thin rope coil from his jacket pocket and looping it around a broken branch. His fingers moved without hesitation, old training guiding every motion. He whispered, "Shadow, wait. Wait." Shadow crouched low, tail stiff, watching, understanding. Ethan hurled a rock past the rider, making it thud heavily against a tree trunk. The man swung his rifle engine revving as he steered toward the sound. A mistake. Ethan yanked the rope. The branch snapped downward, dropping a small avalanche of snow onto the rider. Not enough to bury him, but enough to blind him. Shadow lunged. The dog hit the snowmobile with brutal force, knocking the rider off balance and sending him tumbling into the snow. He landed hard, grunting, his helmet cracking slightly on impact. Ethan sprinted forward and kicked the rifle aside before the man could reach it. The rider lunged at him, revealing a rugged face beneath the cracked visor, harsh, sharp cheekboned with a permanent sneer etched into his features. He looked mid-40s with a close-cropped beard flecked with frost, and the cold fury in his green eyes told Ethan exactly what kind of man he was, one who followed orders without question, one who had done terrible things without remorse. The rider swung a punch. Ethan dodged and countered with a sharp elbow to the jaw, drawing on muscle memory from a different life. The man staggered, then whistled sharply, 3 short blasts a signal. Ethan's heart plummeted. More engines revved back in response. Shadow barked once urgently. Ethan grabbed the rider's collar and shoved him into the snowbank. "Move," he barked to the dogs. They sprinted deeper into the woods, Ethan right behind them as 2 more snowmobiles burst through the storm, one driven by a tall, lanky man with a narrow face, long nose and nervous energy radiating from his movements, the other by a stockier figure with a shaved head and heavy jaw, clearly the enforcer of the group. The lanky man raised a tranquilizer rifle, his pale blue eyes sharp with unsettling precision. Ethan dodged behind a tree as a dart hissed past his shoulder. "They want him alive," Ethan murmured, realizing with grim clarity what that meant. The shaved-head enforcer raised a shotgun instead and fired into the snow near Ethan's feet, spraying powder upward. Shadow leaped sideways, barking furiously. Ethan grabbed a thick branch and hurled it at the enforcer's head, not to injure, but to distract. The man ducked instinctively, cursing loudly. "Split," Ethan ordered. The shepherds understood immediately. Shadow took the lead. The tan and black shepherd flanked, left the gray-tipped one veered right. The pack moved fast, weaving through trees. Ethan followed Shadow. Behind them, the riders cursed, reloading, chasing. The storm raged harder, turning the forest into white chaos. Ethan felt his lungs burning, but adrenaline pushed him forward. The danger sharpened him, woke something dormant inside him, the protector he once was. At a ridge overlooking a frozen ravine, Ethan signaled Shadow to stop. The dog slowed, panting, staring at Ethan with full trust. "We're not outrunning them," Ethan murmured. "We outsmart them." Below the ravine offered cover a series of ice shelves and fallen logs forming natural obstacles. With the blizzard roaring, visibility would be near zero, perfect for disappearing. Ethan slid down the ridge shadow close beside him. As they reached the bottom, the three snowmobiles tore past overhead, unaware they had been outmaneuvered. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the strange, fierce rush of fighting for something that mattered. Shadow nudged his hand gently, the dog's breath warm against the cold. Ethan whispered, "We're not done yet. But we're getting out of this." Shadow let out a low, steady growl, not fear. Readiness. Together, man and dog vanished deeper into the storm. The morning broke over Pine Valley, with a thin veil of sunlight pushing through the leftover fog of the storm, casting the forest in a pale gold that melted slowly across the snow-covered ground. Ethan Cole stood beside the half-frozen creek, where the water crackled under a thin crust of ice, his breath rising in faint clouds as he watched Shadow trot ahead. There was a gentleness in the air that did not match the violence of the previous night, and Ethan felt something inside him unclench, something he had carried for far too long. He followed Shadow's prints in the snow, each step steady, unhurried, his legs heavier than usual from exhaustion, but light with an unfamiliar sense of release. For the first time in years, he did not feel chased by memory. The operation to stop the weapons traffickers had dragged on until dawn. Sheriff Raymond Alcott, a man in his early 50s with a wide, weathered face, salt and pepper beard, and the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much lawlessness, had arrived with federal agents after following Ethan's emergency call. Raymond was a longtime resident of Pine Valley, broad-shouldered, slightly overweight, but known for his quiet integrity. When he had approached Ethan in the aftermath, snow still falling from the trees, he had rested a heavy hand on Ethan's shoulder and said, "You did a hell of a thing tonight, Cole." Ethan hadn't known how to respond. He was still shaking, then not from fear, but from an overwhelming torrent of everything he had been suppressing for a decade. Raymond had studied his face for a moment, his tone softening. "You saved lives. Not just that man. Not just the town. Yourself too, maybe." Ethan had looked away, unable to admit how true those words felt. Now, in the quiet morning, the echoes of the sheriff's voice drifted through Ethan's thoughts like a warm breeze. Ahead, Shadow barked once, a sharp sound that broke the stillness. The dog's posture was alert but relaxed, tail raised, head turning back toward Ethan, as if checking that he was still following. Shadow moved with a confidence Ethan admired, a natural leader, shaped by trials no animal should ever have endured. Ethan paused by a fallen log, brushing a hand across its frost-covered surface. "You're something else, you know," that he murmured. Shadow's ears flicked forward, and he bounded back toward Ethan in a burst of playful energy, snow scattering beneath his paws. Ethan chuckled quietly, catching himself in surprise at the sound. It had been years since laughter had come to him naturally, and yet here it was, fragile, but real. Behind them, the cabin waited in the clearing, its dark wood walls weathered by time, its roof laden with a fresh quilt of snow. That cabin had once been a refuge and a prison, a place where Ethan came to hide from the world after losing Emily and Noah. Emily, the woman with soft brown eyes and the stubborn streak that made him fall in love with her. Noah, the little boy, with hair the color of summer wheat, who used to tug on Ethan's flannel sleeve and ask when they were going camping again. The accident had taken them both. Overnight, he had gone from a proud husband and father to an empty shadow walking through the remains of his life. Ethan swallowed hard as the memories flickered like distant lightning. For years he had lived in the cabin, as if waiting for winter to swallow him whole. Until Shadow appeared, battered, desperate, dragging a dying man behind him. A dog should not have had to show him how to breathe again, but Shadow had. And Ethan could no longer pretend otherwise. As they approached the cabin, a familiar voice called out from the porch. Cole. Sheriff Raymond Alcott trudged through the snow wearing a thick sheriff's parka stretched over his broad frame. He looked both relieved and exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "We finished the sweep," he said, slowing to catch his breath. "The whole group's in custody. Federal boys are hauling them out. Your tip saved us weeks of chasing ghosts." Ethan nodded, pulling his scarf down from his face. "Good." Raymond studied him carefully. "You know, if you want to come back, the department could use someone with your skills." Ethan met the sheriff's gaze, noticing the sincerity behind the offer. Years ago, he would have taken it. Years ago, he hungered for purpose like a man starved. But things were different now. "Thanks, Ray," Ethan said quietly. "But I've got something else I need to do." Shadow nudged Ethan's leg with his muzzle, as if agreeing. The sheriff followed the motion of the dog and chuckled. "Figured as much. Word travels fast. Folks in town said you're thinking of setting up some kind of rescue place." Ethan exhaled slowly, the idea forming more clearly each time it was spoken aloud. "Yeah," he admitted. Shadow wasn't the only one they mistreated. There are other shepherds out there discarded, abandoned, hurt. Dogs people used, then forgot. They deserve better. Raymond nodded approvingly. "If anyone can give them that, you can." Ethan's stared toward the tree line where the storm had finally died. Maybe it's the first thing in years that feels right. Raymond gave a final nod, adjusting his gloves. "Well, just know you've got the town behind you." With that, the sheriff marched away, his boots crunching through the snow until his figure blended into the white horizon. Ethan watched him go, then turned back to the cabin, his cabin. The place that had once held nothing but sorrow now felt like the beginning of something new. Shadow trotted past him, circling the yard with excited energy before bounding into a fresh snowdrift. Ethan stood at the porch steps, watching the dog leap and twist, sending arcs of powder into the air. A warmth spread in Ethan's chest, soft, steady, undeniable. He stepped forward and knelt in the snow, letting Shadow run up to him. The dog pressed his head into Ethan's chest, releasing a low rumble that was neither a growl nor a bark, something gentler, more grateful. Ethan rested a hand on Shadow's neck. The fur was warm beneath his cold fingers. "I thought I saved you," Ethan whispered, his voice unsteady with emotion he no longer feared. "But the truth is, you saved me." Shadow looked up, eyes bright as molten amber. The dog licked the back of Ethan's hand once, gently, almost reverently. Ethan rose to his feet and scanned the land around the cabin, imagining the rescue center he would build, fenced areas for the shepherds' sheltered kennels, a warm training barn, trails where dogs could run free. A place where others like Shadow could find safety. A place where he could finally give back. The cold wind brushed his cheek, carrying the faint scent of pine and the promise of something better. Ethan whispered into the quiet morning, "Thanks, buddy, for bringing me back to life." And as Shadow barked joyfully and raced across the yard, Ethan felt alive in a way he had not since the world fell apart. The forest, the snow, the rising sun, they did not feel like reminders of loss anymore. They felt like a beginning. Even in the coldest nights of our lives, God sends his small miracles, sometimes in the shape of a loyal dog, a stranger's kindness, or the quiet strength we didn't know we still carried. Ethan and Shadow remind us that no one is ever too lost to be found again. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and may the Lord bless you with protection, courage, and light in every step you take. Stay safe Stay faithful and believe miracles still walk among us.